Welcome to the February Microsoft Graph Community Call. I appreciate you guys and girls jumping in to be on this call this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you are in the world. Daryl, who is a peer of mine in the Graph team, who works in the SDKs and Graph Explorer, is currently in Bangalore. So thank you for joining from, what's the time there now, Daryl?
It's 9:30 in the evening.
Well, that's not too bad. So you've already had dinner. You're going to just chill out and watch Sebastien Vardhaman. You're good to go. So yes, these calls happen every month. They do happen on the first Tuesday of the month at 8 a.m. The January call obviously was a little bit different because it would have landed on April 1st. But we do kind of keep these calls on a continual basis on that month. If you are interested, you see the demos today and you're like, I've got some really cool stuff I'd like to show around the Microsoft Graph, I'd highly encourage you to reach out to myself or Daryl. And we can get you on the call as well. And you can showcase what you've been doing with the Microsoft Graph. So these two, I actually reached out, quite honestly, to them both. I've known them for a while now. They're both MVPs. And well, actually, Sebastien had bragged that he'd already done some work with the Microsoft Bot Framework and Graph. And so I was like, well, you can come do it on the community call then. So he kind of, it's his own fault that he got committed himself to this one. But Vardhaman had actually written an excellent blog post on app-only permissions, and I asked him if he could come and present that blog post because it was just a really good summary and rundown of all the different permutations that we know developers get a little bit confused with sometimes. So it's a good opportunity for you guys to meet people in the engineering teams for Microsoft Graph and to see these things, and for also for the community to present back on what they've been working on. So today we have a great lineup of people. Myself just doing the intros, Jeremy Thake, Sebastien, Vardhaman, and Preeti. Hopefully we'll get to Preeti. Preeti only reached out to me yesterday to announce some awesome stuff that the Security Graph API has on Microsoft Graph. So I will be timekeeping Sebastien and Vardhaman to about 20 minutes maximum to make sure that we do have time for Preeti to show off some of the cool stuff that Preeti's been doing from a PM perspective on the security graph on the Microsoft Graph. So from an updates perspective, one thing that we've been talking about internally, and excuse the all these URLs, I'm going to ask Daryl as I do these demos to actually paste these into the chat windows for me. Oops. So that I can focus on actually doing the demonstrations themselves. And so basically, what we wanted to highlight is that we actually share both the OpenAPI and the CDSL files formats so that you can go and subscribe to those inside of, maybe you're using Logic Apps or Microsoft Flow or Power Apps and you want to connect to our APIs. This OpenAPI definition right now is essentially a very large file, which we're working on improving for build timeframes, to define all of the operations and all the data types and everything that you would expect in an API definition as an open API. Daryl happens to be on the organization that kind of owns this. Daryl, do you just want to talk very highly about what the open API is and your involvement in that externally?
Yeah, sure. So OpenAPI is just one of a number of different API description formats. The Graph happens to natively use CSDL to describe its API, whereas OpenAPI is formerly known as Swagger. It's just a different format. And a lot of industry companies kind of grouped around OpenAPI and now formed the Linux. It's a group within the Linux Foundation. And I work on the technical steering committee guiding the future direction. And we have weekly open calls. People can join if you have suggestions that you think should be added to OpenAPI. It's just a GitHub repo, and we have weekly open calls.
Yeah, and then in addition to the OpenAPI definition, which is fairly a new announcement that we announced at Ignite, that you can get to in that GitHub repo, we also basically have these metadata files for both V1 and beta. Now you can get at the metadata files from the Graph Explorer too, as well as from these outputs. But Daryl, do you want to just explain why we're doing this inside of this repo?
Yes. Can you? I didn't know whether I was muted or not, and it was taking a while for the little symbol to appear. Okay. Yeah. So this is part of our continuous integration build pipeline for the SDKs. So there is a new release of the metadata that happens automatically every Tuesday. So we wait for that, and when a new release comes, we do basically grab the new copy of the metadata and commit it into this GitHub repo, so that you can then go and look and see a diff and see exactly what has changed from 1 week to the next on both the beta metadata and the V1 public metadata. And then when that changes, it actually triggers our SDK generation across the languages, and we'll create a PR that then goes to our various SDKs, which we then review manually and then commit in, and hopefully we'll get to our promised SDK release every month very, very shortly.
So I know, because I used to work at a company outside of Microsoft that did this, but the nice thing about us doing this publicly and on a regular cadence is that you can effectively use GitHub's diff perspective to compare and see what's been added, what's been removed in each of the different endpoints from each week's release. So you can see that there wasn't much change here across the beta endpoint, but it's just worth noting that this beta endpoint does change on a regular basis. And so if you are doing things on the beta endpoint for some experiments or so forth, that this project is super useful from that perspective to see across the graph what things are going on. So those links there are super useful from that perspective. So we were just having an internal conversation, and I think it'd be nice just to shout that out as here's where we're at right now, and there'll be some nice announcements around Open API in the build timeframes as well, which will improve what we do there as well. So we have a new survey on the same aka.ms link. It's anonymous. You feel free in the other notes to make it not anonymous if you would like us to follow back up. This month's survey is very much a follow-up from last month's questions, where we got most of our feedback was around the permissions being a confusing area of the Microsoft Graph. So Saurabh Madan, who's a PM on the identity side of the Microsoft Graph family, has made some follow-up questions specifically drilling in on the permissions. So I would really, really appreciate it if you could go and fill out that survey after this call, just to give us a little bit of an idea about prioritization on what things we should go tackle first, to try and help you from a developer experience side around the permissions on Microsoft Graph. So big thank you for doing that. We got some great responses last month. I'd love to get more responses this month. We had about 30% completion rate from the attendees of the call last month, but I would really, really like to see that higher. I know statistically 30% is amazing for a survey, but I would like you guys to prove statistics wrong and have a much higher amount of attendees go complete that survey. So my ask is to type that into a browser now and then focus back on the shared screen, and please be sure to do that once the call is over. So with that, because we have 3 topics to go through, I'm going to introduce Sebastien first. Sebastien is a MVP. He has been a great advocate for us at Microsoft across various different topic areas. Awesome speaker. And if you go to conferences and you see him as a speaker on one of the tracks, I would definitely say he's kind of, for me, is one of the ones I always make sure I go and jump into the room, and because I've always learned something outside of what I do myself, either in the graph or with SharePoint, and now he's kind of picking up the bot framework stuff. So big thank you for Sebastien for jumping on the call this morning, and I will hand the reins to Sebastien.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you. Yep.
I see Daryl saying yes, banging his head around. Let me share my screen quickly. Let's see how this goes. I'm having classic issues. Let's see how far we're going to get through this demo. So I will not go the slides away. I want to show you code. I want to show you what is actually behind the scenes. I've been playing around with the bot framework for the last, I don't know, maybe year and a half or so, mainly playing on the graph side of things. So how we can ask a personal assistant to help us in building kind of a trust between us and the machine to get the data, to ask for my next appointment, to ask for my current emails, to ask for all those kind of things that I think are really, really, really interesting from a scenario perspective. The good thing is that the graph and the bot framework team
I think.
Yeah, I lost your audio,
Yeah.
Sebastien.
someone muted me.
Oh, bad news bears right there. All right, you're back live.
Cool. So the goal is that the team, the graph team and the bot team made it extremely easy to start playing around the bot framework for the graph. So there's a project on GitHub about the bot builder that you can actually find here. So I'm gonna, if someone, I know probably David is over there, will get all of our URLs right here. But I'm using this bot samples as my starting point. And I'm even using that for stuff that I'm building for customers. And there's something called the bot authentication with the MS Graph. And I started with this sample. So I think it's really, really interesting to go through that. All the instructions, everything is available on how to get things working. I won't go through that today on how to make things working, but I want to highlight some of the most interesting thing that makes it really, really, really powerful with the graph. So first of all, the first thing that makes it extremely powerful is the fact that when you go to your bot service, which is here, I created a bot service in Azure. Everything happens in Azure now. This is where you create that. You don't have to go to the older version of the bot framework UI or the bot framework website that was provisioned. So you don't have to go there. And in the settings, where you would basically give a name, give a handle, give a couple of keys around app insights and everything, you can automatically configure OAuth connection settings. What does it mean? It means that I can go here and I can have, and I will change all my client IDs and secret after this call. You can basically here link to an ID and a secret in another tenant or in your own tenant, where you will be able to automatically provision the apps, but also will be able to secure all those applications. So what it means that like for any other type of solutions you're building on the graph, you can basically say, I'm going to use the email, the mail.read, the mail.send, all of that automatically. And the bot framework will actually handle all the authentication for you. So that's the first really, really, really amazing thing that exists between both. It means that you don't have to build any login screen in your bot framework, which would actually be very, very weird to have a login screen inside a bot conversation. So they took care of that with something called the OAuth prompt, and I'm going to show you that right away. So let me show you first what this is all about, and then afterwards I'm going to show you what are the different code elements that are kind of relevant here. So here I have something called the bot framework emulator. That emulator will create a chat window between you and your application that lives somewhere on your machine. So right now I'm using Visual Studio Code. I have a .NET Core application running that serves as my API. So basically you're building an API endpoint that surfaces a set of different messages that you can talk with the bot framework. And here I will just use my endpoint development. So when I do that, I'm connecting to my local host here. I don't know if I can do that. I cannot make it big. I can make it smaller, but it looks like I cannot make it bigger, which is really not cool. Zoom in. I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger for you guys. So here you see I'm talking with my local host 3979 API/messages, and now I have a small welcome screen where it says you can type about me, recent emails, or help me to view those commands again. And here you see that you also have a full inspector and logging window. So the first thing I will do, I will ask questions about myself. I want to retrieve my own profile within the graph. So here I'm going to hit about me, but it actually at this point, oh, well, let's do something here. Let's do sign out. So we have to go through the entire process. I'm going to close this and let's start again. I'm going to go about me. Now it's going to provide me a way to log in. I need to log in because the bot framework doesn't know anything about me. Once it knows something about me, it's going to store my credentials, store my token. It's going to do all the tokens management for myself, so I don't have to do it. But in my case here, I need at least to provide my first set of credentials. So I'm clicking here, all built in, all the different providers or all the different channels, and that's what we're going to see later. All the channels will provide their own UI for that. So here I'm going to my account here, and I will have what we call a magic code. So the only thing you have to do is to copy that one guy here, paste it as a message, and automatically will authenticate you. And then afterwards, it says that got my picture from the graph, automatically embedded in a conversation right here. Here's my name, and I report to Carey Price, the best goaltender of the history of the Montreal Canadiens. That is a first example of what is happening behind the scenes. So how is that actually working? There's a couple of things that happened behind the scenes. The first thing, it recognized that about me was a command that was secured. Then it recognized that this was a magic code, that it has to continue the authentication flow, and then it showed me that piece here. So everything basically happens in that graph authentication bot, where there's a very, very easy set of configuration, and the one that I want to show you is the following here. So we are creating what we call dialogues or conversation dialogues, kind of a flow. There's going to be this dialogue, and afterwards you're going to branch out to this other dialogue, then afterwards to this other dialogue. In my case, I'm using the prompt. So basically, I'm validating on any call to the graph that I'm connected, or that I already have a token, or if not, that I need to prompt the user for a token. Then afterwards, the me step. So here I'm gonna do the actual fetch of the data on the Microsoft Graph. Then afterwards, I'm gonna format that data directly for the user to see it in the bot channel. So what happens when when I'm writing about me? Well, there's a simple thing that happens, which is the following here. I'm talking with one of the nice services of cognitive services, which is LUIS, the language understanding intelligence service, which makes it easy to recognize a string as an intent. So when I say about me, I get an intent that I want to talk about me. I want to have my own profile. So I have in my LUIS application that I created, you just go to luis.ai and you can create multiple intents, including like me. And in there, I have multiple options of it. My user, about me, my profile, myself, which means that I can say me. And it's going to understand it the exact same way as about me. And it's not just through some string manipulation. No. It's really through a full language understanding. So tell me about me, which is not a string that we have in our LUIS here, actually works because it got a score that was high enough for me to use as the right intent. So let's say here, I go here, I find that this is the me intent. So it finds that I'm actually looking for doing a call to the graph about my own user profile. Then I start a dialogue, which is the me dialogue. The me dialogue is the one here, which is actually pretty simple. I'm getting a token response. So if I already have a token available, I will just simply call from the OAuth helpers. I'm going to just go in and ask to list me async. And here I'm doing some interesting stuff here. I'm using the simple graph client, which is a very, 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 very simple graph client that we created to encapsulate some of the calls to the graph. And then I initiate it with my token. I get myself. So basically here, I just go to the graph and I'm using the, and Darryl will be proud of me here. I'm using the graph SDK where I can get to the graph client.me.request that get async, and it automatically gets the request out, automatically gets afterward the data and returns me, which then I can play around with the me here. Afterwards, that I got my manager, me, my photo, so all the calls are automatically being sent to the graph, all authenticated. I do create afterwards a reply, which is a way for me to tell the bot framework that I want to emit something. I want to emit a result, which is in that case a hero card, which is that format here. So an image, a title, and a subtitle. And automatically, the bot framework will format it for me. Meaning that if I'm using other things than a web client or the web chat client, I want to maybe use Skype, I want to use Facebook Messenger, or I want to use any other type of channels that are available in the bot framework, I don't have to code anything for that. The bot framework will take my card, format it the right way to output it to the users, and then we're good to go. So really, really helpful, really easy to make it happen. So this is how it works on my machine here. But a bot on your machine is basically talking to yourself, which can be a little bit weird sometimes. And this is where we get into the tricky part of our demo. Because a couple of minutes ago, I had some issues. So let's see how that goes. So, or worst case, I will be able to show you using my conversation history that I have with my bot on Teams. So here I have a bot that was deployed directly to Teams. This bot is what we call a channel. It's one of the channels that we can talk with the graph fairly easily. When you're in your bot settings, you can actually go in and select all the channels that you want to talk with. So in my case, I'm talking to three different channels. I'm talking with the web chat, which is basically just a web embedded chat client. I'm talking with Microsoft Teams, and I'm also talking with Cortana. So let's see if we can make all those demos today. So within Teams, I just go in Teams. It also I'm using the web client, but it also definitely works on the rich client. And here I will say about me. And I will check if I got a request. It says that a method is not allowed, which is interesting. I get some weird feedback from Teams right now, which is not a good thing. But anyway, let's pretend let's go back in time, let's say. I would say about me here. So I can have the conversation. We can also have the same panel that tells the user, hey, welcome, click here to do about me, click here to do recent emails or whatever. And automatically Teams detects the exact same thing. And the best thing about Microsoft Teams is that you don't need to provide that magic code, because Teams will automatically pop up a window and scrape the UI of that window for the magic code and brings it back and automatically authenticate you. Then afterwards, as you can see, the result of my hero card is not the same. It's a little bit different. Why? Because it is not the it's not the same thing. It's not the same channel. So they basically change the effort. They changed the way that the format or the UI is being displayed here. So easily I can go here, I can go to my bot, and I can just click on Microsoft Teams, and it's going to automatically add this channel to your own Microsoft Teams. Make sure that you enable side loading of apps on your Microsoft Teams, or if you don't do that, that's not going to work. For sure, the last one, Cortana, will also not work. And I'm going to just post a blog post as a follow-up with all the demos working. But the issue or the idea that I want to show you is the following. Cortana is basically a bot sitting on your computer at all times. First, if you're like me and you're like somewhere else than in the US, make sure that everything is English US on your machine if you want to use Cortana with custom bots or custom skills that they call, because if you don't do that, you won't be able to use it. It's for now only for EN US. So I did it, and now I can go here. I can start doing stuff. I can ask graph. So basically here I called it. I called it. I gave it a name. Ask graph about me, for instance. What's going to happen here? It's going to go through the API, go through my service. We'll go through everything exactly the same flow with the magic code and everything. And then in the end, here I might get an issue with that. I'm going to pose this, but the really, really big thing is that it's also fully enabled with the voice. So let's say I want to use Cortana voice as a way for me to get my profile or get my latest email. I can do ask graph about me.
There's a problem with the skill you selected.
And then
Please try again.
and then you will get the data here. So let me fix that. And Jeremy, if you don't mind, the end, if you can give me back 1 minute of demo so we can maybe finish this one, so we can have the full, full working there.
I for one know these things happen. I've been on stage in front of 1,000 people with this kind of event. So like a true pro, you've been able to demo it to that point. Before we go over to Vardhaman, in terms of this flow, the Microsoft Teams bot and the Cortana approach is essentially the same code, right?
It's exactly, there's absolutely no difference. The only difference I have, there's one line that is different here, which I'm checking if there's it's Cortana or not. And the reason why is there are some cards that are not supported. So for instance, Cortana doesn't support base 64 images. Right. So it needs to be a link, but the graph is giving me my profile as a base 64 image. So I cannot use it. So that's why here I have an if include picture. I have that. So in my profile skill on my Cortana bot, I don't show the picture. I just show, hi, Sebastien, here's your manager. But besides that, one.
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate you. I know you didn't have this going when I asked you at the beginning of the month whether you could do this. So thanks again for doing that. We will transfer over to Vardhaman now. Let me just share my screen very quickly, just to make that transfer a bit easier. And we'll come back to Sebastien. Hopefully you'll be able to get that going. So Vardhaman is an MVP based out in the UK. And he's going to talk about Microsoft Graph from an app-only perspective. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, Vardhaman has a great blog that I personally learned a lot from with his work in the SharePoint space and various other bits and pieces he does around Microsoft development. And I reached out to him to ask whether he'd be willing to present today. So if you aren't following him on his blog and following him on his Twitter, I highly encourage you to do that, because yeah, as I say, it's yet another person in the community that I learn a lot from what he's sharing in his day-to-day work. So thanks for joining, Vardhaman. If you want to just share your screen and take over, and we can get going on what you wanted to share on app only.
Yeah, sure. So let me start sharing my screen. Let me know when you can start seeing it.
Yeah, we can see your PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
we can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, I've got a couple of slides just to set the context and around application permissions in the graph. So yeah, we'll talk about what exactly are application permissions, what are the scenarios in which you would need them, and a couple of ways, a couple of options which you can use to configure the application permissions in the graph. Now, of application permissions and app only auth are kind of are the same thing, so the terms can be used interchangeably. So in this kind of demo, since Azure AD says application permissions, so I'll be using the term application permissions. So yeah, let's get started. Yeah. So yeah, you saw the slide before. I just wanted to mention if you wanted to kind of have a chat, or rather, if you have any feedback after the session, just follow me on Twitter and we can continue the conversation. So I won't take up too much time talking about myself here. Yeah, so why application permissions? Now, if you're building a solutions, if you want to get data back from the Microsoft Graph, so basically you have two options. One is to use delegated permissions, and the next one is to use application. Now, delegated means that when you access the Microsoft Graph, you access it on behalf of the user currently signed in. So whatever permissions the user has, you can only get back that particular data. So things like current email, current messages, tasks, and so on. When there is a scenario where there isn't a user present, things like if you have a scheduled process, or if you cannot provide a prompt for the user to sign in, then application permissions are really useful. So first reason I think of using application permissions is when there is no user context available. So a prime example of this is if you have a scheduled process. For example, if you have a process which runs daily or weekly. Now, an example of this is we had created a scheduled process to read user profiles from Azure AD and update some relevant data in the SharePoint user profile. So since this process had to run daily, there was no user context, there's no user prompt. So we decided to use application permissions to read the Azure AD profiles from the graph. Now, another example is if you need some sort of elevated permissions. Now, an example of this is if you are building, say, a provisioning solution, and if you want to provision teams and groups, but at the same time, you don't want to allow the permission to all the users to create all the groups and teams they want. You want some sort of approval process there. So users might be able to request the groups and teams from the graph, but there has to be some kind of approval, like maybe the manager or maybe IT say, yes, okay, it's fine to go and create this group or team. Now, when that request gets approved, the code or the provisioning code picks up that request and uses the graph to create the group or team. So you're doing some sort of elevated operation which normal user don't have permission on. And yeah, as I said before, instead of using the user context, your solution itself has an identity in Azure AD, and that identity can be used to grant certain permissions which are allowed to the user. And that is where application permissions come in. Now, because the application permissions can be used to do elevated operations, it's only the admins which can grant consent. And normal users will have to request an admin to grant consent on an Azure AD app registration. So moving forward, we will talk about this in the demo coming up, but just wanted to give you a context. So when I said that the solution needs to have an identity in Azure AD, it's basically through an app registration. So when a solution talks to Azure AD, it uses the client ID of the app registration to kind of uniquely identify which solution is making the call and so on. The two options which the solution can use to identify itself is client secret and then the certificate. Now, yeah, we'll discuss both these options in detail in the demo coming up. But the way Azure AD kind of figures out that the request coming in for the authentication is genuine or can be trusted is if the solution is able to provide one of these two kind of artifacts. One is either the client secret or if it's a certificate. Right. So I think that's as far as there's a couple of slides I had. Now let's kind of jump into the demo. So as I said before, the solution needs to have an identity in Azure AD. Now I'm in Azure AD and I've gone to Azure AD screen and the new app registrations experience, which I think is really good compared to the previous one. Just refresh. Yeah, and I've gone ahead and created an app registration for the purpose of this demo. Now you can see that I've got a client ID. Now this is used to kind of uniquely identify the application in Azure AD. Now when my solution, when my code uses this client ID to talk to Azure AD has to know what sort of permissions does the solution have. Now that can be done by going to the API permissions blade and adding in any permissions which you want to grant your solution. Now when I click on add permission, I get the different resources which can be granted permission on. I'll select the Microsoft Graph, and as I said before, you have the two options, delegated and application. Delegated is when the solution wants to access the graph on behalf of the signed in user. But in this case, since we're talking about application permissions, which is mainly used in case of background services, etc. I'll select this, and then I have the different Microsoft Graph resources which I can give permissions on. And in the demo, I'm going to query the graph to get me a list of all the groups in the current tenant. So for that, I need the group.read.all permission. Now, how am I able to determine that I need this particular permission? I'll go to the for that I'll go to the Graph REST API documentation, and I'll go to the relevant endpoint, which is list groups in this case. And then there's this permissions section over here, which kind of tells me here that if I'm using application permissions, I'll at least need group.read.all, or it's slightly more higher is group.readwrite.all. So that's how I'm able to determine that I want to, for example, get the groups. So I will use the least privileged one, which I need right now, which is the group.read.all. So that's how I'm able to select it here. And I'll click add permissions. So I've already done this in order to speed up the demo. And then that will appear here. And since I am an admin, I'll be able to grant the permissions for the solution or the app registration. Now, once the permissions are kind of granted, Azure AD is able to know that whenever a request comes in with this particular client ID, it should have the group.read.all permission. And the way to which the solution can uniquely identify that it's a trusted solution that is either with the client secret or with the certificates. First, we'll talk about the client secret. So personally, I like to think of this as nothing but a password. So just like users have username and password, the client secret is a password for the application. The way to create a client secret is just by clicking on a new client secret, and you can select when does it expire, and then you can click on add, which will give you a client secret, something like this. Now, for the demo, we'll talk about certificates later after the first demo. For the demo, I've got a simple console application here, which I've configured with the client ID of the app registration. I've copied the client secret, and I've included it in the solution as well. Now, what the console application here does is it's relatively straightforward. It uses adal.net, which is the Active Directory authentication library, to get me an access token based on the client ID and client secret. Once it gets the access token, then I can start using that access token in my request to the graph. So this particular function uses adal.net. It requests Azure Active Direct Azure AD an access token, which is for this particular resource, graph.microsoft.com, and with this particular client ID and client secret. So let me run this. Yeah, so the request has gone through. I have got an access token back. Now, this is not at all user friendly, as you can tell, but this is a great site, jw.ms, which I use quite frequently to decode the access tokens which you get back. So this has become slightly more readable now. So as you can see, it's the app ID, which is the client ID, which is for our app registration. Then it has the display name, and most importantly, it has this roles property, which is group.read.all, which tells that this particular access token has the permission to read all the groups in the tenant. That's kind of a way in which you can determine you have an access token, but what permissions does this access token have? What all operations in the graph can this access token do? The audience is also kind of the graph.microsoft.com, so you're able to determine based on the access token what permissions does it have. Now going back to my code, let me continue this. So as I'll get this access token back, and all I'm doing after that is I'm using the HTTP client to add this access token in the authentication header, and then I'm making a request to the graph.microsoft.com/v1/groups endpoint, which will just help me read all the groups. So let me just continue, and you can see that I've got all the groups back which are present in my tenant. So I've got a couple of groups there, which I'm able to get back from the graph. Right. So that was authentication using the client ID and the client secret. Now, the next kind of piece is using the certificate. So I still need to use the client ID, which I said is kind of which makes my application unique in Azure AD. But the next part is using the certificate. So it's a slightly bit more complex to work with the certificate, because with the client secret, you could just click on the new client secret over here, and you are good to go after creating the secret. But with the certificate, you need to create either a self-signed certificate, or you need to create a certificate get a certificate from a CA. Now, for dev purposes, creating a self-signed certificate is fine, because you just want to use it for testing. So I use this self-signed certificate script created by the SharePoint PNP team. It's a PowerShell script. You could also use something like make cert, but this script is what I go with a lot of times. So I won't go into the detail of this script, but once you've downloaded this, you can just run it by passing it the name of the certificate, the start date, and the end date. I'll post a link to this script after the call. So once you have this, the script will create a public and the private key, which is the .cer and the .pfx file. Going back in Azure AD, you'll have to upload the public key, which is the CER file here. And the private key now depends on where you are deploying your solution to. So for now, since I'm just using a console application over here, my private key has just been imported on my host machine. If you are running the code in an Azure function, or maybe from a web app in Azure, you'll have to import your private key in that particular. Depends on where you're running the code from. So yeah, I've got the certificate configured, and I'll run the second demo. So the only difference being, instead of using the client secret, I'm using the client certificate. So just to kind of give you a bit of overview, again, I'm using the same client ID, tenant domain. The thumbprint of the certificate and the store name and store location are relevant because I've imported the certificate on my local machine. Then there's a bit of code to get access of the certificate on my local machine. Again, I'll share this code after the call. And once I have the certificate, I'm again using adal.net to acquire the token on the graph.microsoft.com resource. Once I've got this access token, I'll again I'll copy this and I'll go to my favorite tool. I'll paste this. Now the certificate is, the access token is more or less similar. You can see that it's got the group.read.all permission. And another interesting property is it's called this app ID CR as 2. Now, what does that mean? If I go to the claims tab, it's able to tell me that if the value was 1, that means a client ID and client secret was used. And because this value is 2, a certificate was used. So you are able to tell from the access token what combination of the secret or the combination of the certificate was used to get your token. Yeah, more or less the token is same. And again, I'll just continue the code. When I get the access token from then on, the code is pretty much similar. I'll add the access token as a header in a request to the graph, to the /groups endpoint. And when I continue, I'll again get the same kind of groups back. I've got like 3 or 4 groups in here. All right. So those were like a couple of demos. First one was using a client ID and client secret. The next one was using the client ID as well as the certificate. Now, yeah, I've got this blog post on this, which also deals in with SharePoint Online permissions. But if you just want to focus on the Microsoft Graph part of it, you can have a look as well. All the code which I did demo is included in this blog post. I'll post a link to this after the call. Yeah, so that was it. Just a couple of options in which you can use application permissions in the graph. So that's it from my side.
Thank you, mate. I really appreciate that. There was some questions around, excuse me. There was some questions around the perspective of using you use the ADL SDK there to do that communication versus MSAL. And someone, sorry, it wasn't someone, it was Brian Jackett brought up a good point that there is actually in the Azure AD Microsoft Auth library for .NET, there is a wiki that currently does the descriptions of what is the difference between the ADL and MSAL libraries.
Yeah.
MSAL is the new Microsoft authentication libraries that were released in May last year. People have been expecting those to be generally available for a little bit now, and they are production supported, but what has happened is they're not quite ready to have the generally available stamp on them. The generally available stamp will come once there is significant usage across some of either our internal systems or external systems. But in terms of if you have any issues with it, you can have support tickets raised and they will be treated as production supported libraries. It's just the identity division within Microsoft have made decisions on when they will stamp something as a generally available. But if you're starting net new projects, we should be using the MSAL libraries. And we're actually just going through an exercise, and we had the call this morning that we want to make sure that all of our samples and our tutorials already do this, and our quick starts already do this. Where there is an MSAL library available, we will be using MSAL for the variety of the platforms that MSAL supports. But specifically for .NET, this is a good example of just having that comparison of the differences between the MSAL library and the ADL library. So thank you very much for presenting that, Vardhaman. It's great to just kind of have you highlight the different things that you do in terms of working out permissions by going into our docs and how you kind of manage those things within the portal.azure.com aspect of this as well. So a big thank you for sharing that today. That's awesome. Now, before I hand over to Preeti, I just want to double check. Sebastien, you still there? You weren't you weren't available on the Teams chat when I tried.
I am.
Have you managed to get that back working?
Yes.
Oh, I had very confidence that you'll be able to do that. So do you want to just take over the screen just to show it working so we believe that what you were showing us?
Looks like I had two times the same port being used using .NET Core, so it basically broke everything. So
yeah, I've had that problem myself. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know how to kill it, so I basically rebooted the machine. A good old reboot. So 1 minute and I'm going to be done. Here I'm back to my Teams conversation. Here I can say about me like I was doing before. And here I will be prompted that I need to please log in. So I will just hit login here. The good thing is that Teams will handle all that magic code and everything. A pop-up happens and magic happens behind the scenes. And automatically, hello, Sebastien Levert, you report to Carey Price. So really, really cool stuff happening. Now, I think the most cool stuff is the one here. So I'm going to close those emails. My God, today is awful. I can just go here, talk to Cortana and say, ask Graph about me. And now I have my hello, Sebastien Levert, you report to Carey Price and that kind of stuff. What is a little bit even cooler is that you can really go through natural language. So ask Graph to show my most recent emails. And now I have all my emails that are being shown here, where I can say I want to see this email. It's going to basically open Edge for whatever reason. Using this account, I'm going to put in my password, and it will make my life easier because now I can read my email directly from my Cortana skill that was basically created and integrated right inside my Windows. So that's what I wanted to show today.
That's awesome. Thank you for showing that working.
You're welcome.
What's interesting as a scenario there, if I just share my screen again, is there's definitely some been announcements around Cortana, and internally at Microsoft, the Cortana team has moved into actually within the same organization as ours inside Perry Clark, who is our corporate vice president. And there's definitely a direction that they're going after with Cortana, and the graph scenarios that I wanted to show in this really kind of aligns with where we're going there with this. So if you aren't familiar with bots, I think as more and more of your customers or internal employees are using Windows 10 and that Cortana is available there, and people get more comfortable with the voice assistants in general, that I think this is going to be a great use case, not just for having these as bots that you kind of type into in Microsoft Teams, but also as part of the operating system at a Cortana level as well. So yeah, thank you again, Sebastien. Will you be sharing that code that you've written today as well?
Yep, it's going to be on my GitHub later today. So I'm going to let it know, and we'll probably embed it into your blog post, I guess.
Yeah, we'll be in the blog post that we share on the Graph blog, and also in this slide deck as well. So big thanks for that, Sebastien. Thanks for getting that fixed. I hit the same thing 5 minutes before my Ignite session last year, so I should have remembered to let you know that one definitely exists. So with 8 minutes remaining, Preeti, sorry to have you on last here. We'll probably have to park a demo until afterwards, but did you want to just talk to what you're doing in the security graph API on the Microsoft Graph around the connectors that you've got?
Yeah, sure. So what I'll do is I'll talk about the connectors in this call, and then we'll push the demo out to the next one, just so that we have sufficient time to cover everything. So basically, we have for the Graph Security API, it's not only the code approach of authentication and connecting to Graph Security API to get data of alerts and everything. We have new connectors which allow you to connect to the Graph Security API without writing any code, which is basically using the Logic Apps, Flow, and Power Apps connectors, 200 connectors that's available at this point. So there are a lot of these scenarios of security management, automated investigations, and automated context that you can get using this. What I'll do is, instead of showcasing the demo, I'll just point to the blog post real quick and like kind of walk you through that in terms of the scenarios, and then we can do the demo next time. So I can share my screen real quick. And yeah, let me know if you're able to see my screen. Hello?
Yeah, we can see that now, Preeti.
Okay, cool. So this is the blog post that actually covers different scenarios and how do you really get started. So basically, depending on the steps are pretty much similar for Logic Apps or Flow or Power Apps. Basically, there's connector reference documentation and detailed documentation as well. As an Azure Active Directory tenant administrator, give consent to the connector, and that'll get you connected with the security API itself. And you can start with a blank application, but you have to start with a trigger because we have all actions enabled in this. And these are all the supported actions. You can get alerts. You can get alerts by an ID. The get alerts is basically all OData queries that you can pass to filter or order by your alerts and all, and or by certain properties. You can filter and get alerts by certain property as well. And then you have update alert and create subscriptions and manage your subscriptions as well. So basically, from a user scenario perspective, you can go ahead and now automate your security monitoring and management. What that means is basically you can actually hold for alerts every 15 minutes or so, get your high severity alerts and handle them separately by assigning it to your analyst and notifying them via an SMS and an email itself. Or, and in parallel, you can also go ahead and push all your alerts into Event Hub for later processing. So here what we're doing is we are prioritizing certain alerts based on the severity and giving them special treatment for prioritized investigations. Yet another scenario is basically your automated security response handling itself, which is, suppose there are some security products like Microsoft Cloud Security Solutions and all, which deals with user-based actions, and they give you user context. So you can let your user know whether they want to ignore this alert or they want some investigation on it. And for that, what you can do is basically for the alert, you can actually look at the user information, and then based on that, you can send the user an email with options. Basically, the options are ignore this alert or I'm unsure, which means I need more investigations. Based on the options selected, you can actually have investigations on by creating a Teams channel for it, or you can go ahead and close the alert based on user input. So this is yet another example of how automation is possible for alert responses. There's automation of security investigations as well. Usually the first level of security investigation involves a lot of details in terms of going through different security products for an analyst and then finding out what are the common patterns across these alerts. Now, all of this is automated using the Graph Security connector. So basically, it's again looking for alerts, and within the alerts, you look for the IP information across different alerts. You're matching the IP, the private IP that's available across these alerts, and get a list of those alerts. And the analyst gets that list for enabling his first level of investigation. So the analyst can now focus on the next step in terms of what else is interesting with those. So that itself gets automated as well. So these are some example scenarios. And in the next sync, I'll actually demo these as well. So Jeremy, we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, awesome. We're actually right on the hour, Preeti. So
Yeah, I just want to talk about the hackathon real quick before we
sure.
So these are all like links that's available. We'd appreciate your just the earlier slide as well. That would be helpful.
We were actually we're out of time, Preeti. So
okay, sure. So yeah, this is basically our hackathon is ending as of this month. Any entries, definitely go ahead, start submitting, and details are there at the dev post, like graphsecurityhack.devpost.com.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, and we look forward to getting a bit more of a detailed demo on that in a later community call. Just in terms of next month's call is March 5th at 8 a.m. That's the first Tuesday of March. If you would like to present in this call, you've got some cool stuff that you're working on around the Microsoft Graph, please reach out to me on jthake@microsoft.com or @jthake on Twitter. Big thank you to Vardhaman and for Sebastien and Preeti for presenting today. Really appreciate you guys joining the call. The recording will be available and so will the blog post, so you can rewatch this. We'll definitely make sure that we have the source code that was demoed in these sessions that are available in their personal GitHubs, so that you can go grab those and try those yourselves. I personally would love to hear what you're doing around those app-only scenarios and security graph scenarios that have just been announced, and also with the Cortana scenarios as well. We are building some cool demos out for the Build conference that's coming up in an undisclosed timeframe still, and so please check out for those things as we move closer to those dates. So a big thank you for joining today, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.